So I actually made a YouTube short recently about this topic, but it was very difficult to condense into 60 seconds what I was trying to say and what I wanted to share. So I figured I would make an extended version video about this. So the other day I was watching The Real Housewives of Atlanta, the reunion episode, and at the time of this video, it just came out a few days ago, the reunion episode. And if you've been following the show, or if you're remotely familiar, one of the women on the show was married to a textbook narcissist, like almost comical how evidently shitty of a person he is in that sense. And he showed up to the reunion and he's kind of defending himself. And also in the back of my mind, I'm like, this is crazy. Like, these people have children, and in order to protect his ego, he's here on this stage to, like, you know, have his word on this show that's otherwise about just like women getting into catfight. It's like, dude, like, get out of here. Like, you got kids, like, they're gonna see this one day. Anyway, so in watching his behavior, again, it's partially comical how ridiculous he is and his antics, but also partially like so disturbing because we've all been around people like this. He's just kind of, I think, like, not good at hiding it. so it feels more apparent and less, I guess, dangerous when you see him on TV. But in watching his behavior, it reminded me of a guy that I briefly dated that I made a video about on this channel years ago. Some of you might remember. I went to visit this guy in Atlanta that I had been talking to basically every day for like 2 months. He wanted me to come visit him. I spent a weekend with him. It was like a different person for those 48 hours. And in watching this guy on TV, it reminded me of my experience, some of the behavioral aspects that were like chillingly similar. So as I was watching this reality TV episode, I literally took notes. I made a list of 5 like dead giveaways of narcissism. And there's so many videos, of course, on YouTube about narcissism. People are fascinated by this topic and human psychology in general, right? Everybody feels that they've dated or married or had kids with, or their parent is a narcissist. So it's not like I'm adding anything revolutionary here, and nor am I an expert. I'm not, you know, a psychologist, obviously. But the reason I wanted to make this video is that these 5 things that I picked up on, they're not something you would study in a textbook. Like, you know, when you think of narcissism, there's certain themes that always come up, right? It's in the word narcissism, narcissistic behavior, right? Very self-absorbed. It's all about me, lack of empathy. These are the clear definition phrases that are used when we talk about textbook narcissism. So what I'm going to share, the 5 signs that I noticed, are not necessarily obvious, but now that I've experienced it and just even seeing it on my screen when I was watching this episode, I'm like, everybody should know that these are 5 signs. So number 1, first thing I noticed, no sense of humor. No sense of humor. Like, you make a joke, sort of self-deprecating, maybe a lighthearted joke at their expense, but nothing mean-spirited. They cannot take a joke. Narcissists feel slighted by things that have nothing to do with ill intent. And I think this goes back to, they say that narcissism comes from a deep rooted insecurity, really. Like, it's really like a mask to make up for profound insecurity. So it makes sense that there's a lack of humor because they perceive things as insults that are not actually insults at all. Number 2, passive aggressive energy. So I think this is why a lot of people end up in abusive situations with narcissists, because it's not necessarily evident or loudly aggressive. What's the word I'm looking for? Or aggressive in a physical sense, but passive aggressive, right? So it's kind of subtle, at least in the beginning. Watching that guy on The Real Housewives of Atlanta, or my experience with the guy who I went to visit, I just realized they're both from Atlanta. That's interesting. That's a strange coincidence. It's like a lot of put downs, But sometimes there's subtle put downs, like, oh, well, I've lived more than you, I'm older than you, so you don't understand this yet, but XYZ. So like condescending, but not necessarily always in an obvious way. And a sort of, yeah, like maybe patronizing is the better word. Because patronizing implies, like, sometimes it seems like it's a compliment, but it's actually like a backhanded compliment that they'll give you. Third thing is flip-flopping with mood swings. Like my experience with the guy who I went to visit, I just remember 1 second he'd be happy and seem like he's enjoying his time with me, and then the next minute it's like a shift, and you can read it on their face, like they're unhappy with something, but it's so sudden and out of nowhere that you're thrown off. So you're kind of like always walking on eggshells because the person is inconsistent with their mood and with their emotions. Number 4 is being very preoccupied with how people view them in public, like their public presentation. So here's a great example of this. The guy who I went to visit years ago, he told me that whenever a new neighbor would come into the neighborhood where he lived, he would bring them cookies and greet them like, hey, welcome to the neighborhood. So when somebody tells you this, right, you're like, oh my God, he's so sweet, like he's so thoughtful, what a great neighbor. But having spent time with him, I realized that when we were in public, he was very charming, very polite, very nice. But behind closed doors with me, like when we were back at his place, he was rude to me and like mean-spirited. So it's interesting because there's this like dichotomy of like, they can be really nice and well-mannered and seemingly warm to others, but you see this other side that is so different from that. And for me, it's funny because I remember my takeaway with that was like, wow, so I wonder how many people I've met in life who were really nice to me or like left a great first impression, but it's like totally a facade. And it's part of an act to come off as the harmless, nice guy in the neighborhood. But if you actually spend more time with the person, you kind of see that mask slip and you see this darker side they have where they're very difficult to be around and difficult to deal with in terms of their personality and their behavior. With the guy from the Real Housewives, that's another great example. On the show, he always presented himself a certain way, like he would do these big, dramatic, romantic things for his wife on the show, like a super romantic dinner, but he would belittle her the whole dinner, and then she'd complain about that, and he'd be like, I created this amazing dinner for you, like you're so ungrateful, blah, blah, blah. So it's like, again, this preoccupation with the aesthetics and the present, how things look, but the intention is not pure, and the behavior and the emotions behind it are not pure. But they care more about how things look than how things feel. Finally, the last thing that I wrote down that I noticed was a juvenile mindset, meaning almost the way that a kid sees things in black and white. I've noticed that it's the same thing with narcissists. A lack of ability to see the nuances in things or the details, which is what children do, right? Like children have a hard time with nuances. They just see sort of obvious surface. And this is kind of the most interesting, I think, takeaway out of these 5 signs that I've mentioned, because narcissists are also considered very intelligent, like intellectually, usually they're well-studied, well-spoken, but it's like the emotional intelligence is very, very low. And that's what's so interesting to me, that somebody can be so intelligent in one sense, but it's almost like the higher that quotient is, the lower the EQ seems to be, right? And that's a stereotype, right? That people with really high IQ have really low EQ. It's interesting to me that somebody could be so advanced intellectually. So the guy that I dated, for example, really, really smart guy, really successful, had been like a biology major in school, so scientific kind of brain, scientific minded, but he would see things in such a, again, a black and white way without the ability to think outside the box. Like no sort of creative element to his mindset of reacting to people, giving people the benefit of the doubt, right? These things that as you grow older, you tend to develop more empathy towards that. And again, children tend to lack those skills, right? Children tend to be more reactive. So these are my takeaways. I'm curious, as always, what you guys think. Again, I'm not an expert on this topic, obviously, but it was just striking to me watching, it was like Groundhog's Day. You know, it was uncanny to me to watch this episode of reality TV that is meant for entertainment, right? But watching this guy and seeing certain things, like, again, this seriousness on his face with no humor, no sort of shift and no warmth, no emotion in his face unless he would get riled up. And it reminded me of the guy that I had dated. So yeah, curious what you guys think. Let me know in the comments and stay tuned for my next video.